open source and programmers and how using open source impacts your life as a programmer in your workplace. The second research question is how does it really shift the process of innovation itself? And we'll see at the NASA study that a lot of it has to do with the way we think about and the way we articulate our R&D problems once we try to reach out to many other disciplines. In another study that I have also doing with Sarah Leibovich here on makeathons and 3D printing, we will see that a lot of the best practices that we know about R&D and product development actually fail in these settings. So what are those new practices? That's kind of a practice-based approach, looking at what are the emergent practices that people are doing in the field right now to be able to deal with these new processes. And lastly is, of course, the limitations, the boundaries of those new models. And when do they work? When do they fail? And can we see something new? So it was one of these conferences that I got to know the HCI community, that I was talking and giving this talk, and then Robert Kraut told me, it's one thing to say, you know, what's not working. How about doing something about it? And he told it to everyone in the crowd. And then afterwards, I went and started talking to him. So I have to say, I'm very grateful for that interaction with the HCI community, because thanks to it, I have started to do some field experiments and to really think, how can we nudge these limitations and boundaries? How about bringing experts and crowds potentially together and not saying either experts are doing R&D or crowds are solving it all? How about bringing them together? So that's kind of the overarching umbrella. And now let's go a little bit to the literature and why I think this is interesting. So from a theoretical perspective, most of the theories and the things that we know today about these phenomena stays on the online world, I would say, in the sense that most of it looks at the community and how to design those communities, how to make it work better. And my research looks at the intersection of what happens on those communities, but with organizationals and professionals inside. So I'm a field researcher. I go into organization and study what happens once they use these types of processes. What we do know in organizations is that it's very hard for people to collaborate across boundaries. We have plenty of literature showing how hard it is to translate and to understand and to work together. We just heard a lot about the team literature that has shown it over the years. So it begs the question, how come if we know that people reject knowledge from outside of their discipline, have a hard time translating, how can we expect this to work actually? You know, it's one thing that it works online, but what happens when we want this to be implemented into organizations and their R&D process? The literature would predict rejection, basically, of the knowledge coming from outside and of people that are outside of the domain trying to solve the professional's problem. But we know that the literature is not necessarily as updated as we would like. So there's been a call in the literature to reinvestigate the change in those boundaries, in those knowledge work boundaries, in the professional boundaries. And this paper is kind of a first stab into this kind of nudge. Let's try to see how is it different today. Is it really different, or are we seeing the same thing? So this is based, now we'll go into NASA land. And maybe it's a nice kind of, I don't know, escape from the reality that was shown to us, the painful reality right now. So now we can kind of think about Mars and exciting things. This was my dissertation field study that I was conducted for 3 years before, throughout, and after the experimentation that NASA conducted with open innovation platforms. If anyone watched the movie Martian, so you remember some of those challenges that they have. These are the type of people that I study, in the sense that really worry about the health of the astronauts in space, their performance. So it's called Space Life Science Division. So you have life scientists that basically think about life science in space. So we'll talk more about the cool things that they've done while I was taking mostly field notes. But they were very generous to let me go into their labs, shadow them. So from a method perspective, my data sources were, a lot of it was observation. So I participated in a lot of the work meetings around the R&D projects that were experimented with open innovation. I was able to record everything. More than 100 semi-structured interviews with the different scientists and engineers that went through this process. And one important data source is the documents themselves of R&D projects. So I always mention that it's very important, I think, to talk to people, to hear what they're saying, but then eventually to see actually what's happening in the project themselves. Is there a change in the project, in the R&D product development process, because of using open, online, collective intelligence type of platforms? And let me take you to that experiment, and then I'll tell you kind of what happened. So this is Space Life Science Director at the different divisions and the different labs that I was studying. Those blue bubbles are the most strategic R&D challenges for that year. So the brave thing that NASA did, unlike many organizations that are using crowdsourcing, they didn't pick some kind of a nice problem for PR and marketing. They really took their strategy plan for that year and said, these are the 14 challenges that we are stuck with, that this is kind of the thing that we can't solve right now. We have the best expert, and this is what we need to work for the next year. How about for 1 year, while we're trying to work it and solve it with the best people at NASA, with experts outside, collaborators, contractors, we post them on these open innovation online platforms that people have been talking about. So that's what they did for 1 year simultaneously, trying to solve these problems. The platforms they use are Innocentive, Yet to Come, and TobeCoder. Innocentive, a wide variety of individuals, Yet to Come, more engineering, techie, and startups, and TobeCoder, mostly software. And I assume you all know those platforms, so I'm gonna kind of run through that part. So to give you a taste of how different the process is, when the engineers and scientists started working with it, they kept on repeating this sentence of this is a whole different way of doing business, and I tried mapping how is that different. So from a boundary perspective, if you think about the way we work today, usually you know on each project who are the people inside and outside of the project. The boundaries are pretty well defined when you go into a project versus here they had no idea who's going to come and try to solve these problems. The underlying assumption is in the traditional model that experts rule. Experts are the reason why we have, all those years of education, right? When we have an R&D aching problem, we bring the best experts to the table versus in the open innovation platform, the underlying assumption is almost the opposite. Anyone, right? A kid from Africa can help solve NASA's problem. And that we will see raised a lot of interesting challenges. From a hierarchical perspective, the hierarchy doesn't even exist in those open innovation online platforms versus in traditional organization. Obviously, it's a very hierarchical, negotiation-based, and high control-based process. And lastly, if you think about the nature of the process, it's completely different. Online, a different pace, right? 3-6 months, nothing more than that. R&D process is long, heavy. Each of those projects that I showed you spends between $5 to $15 million of a budget. This is like $5,000 of an award, or $10,000 or $30,000 was the highest award. So it gives a very different nature, and of course the geographical nature of it is different as well. So what happened in the experiment? Those 14 problems, in less than 3 months, over 3,000 solvers tried solving it from 80 different countries. So imagine we're talking about this 1 year, right? In the same time that NASA experts are building workshops and working on it and studying, and maybe if we count all the experts outside of NASA that's collaborating, we have 1,000 people. Here you have 3,000 people, of course not experts, trying to solve these problems. The surprising results were that 3 out of those very challenging 14 problems were solved. And especially one became known, and you may recall that one, is the home run solution called for predicting solar flares. So I don't know if you know, but we have kind of a solar max and solar min, and it's a big known heliophysics problem that basically every few years there is a probability that we'll get this huge solar storm. And obviously people have been working on it for a decade, and there are many predictive models, but in 24 hours in advance, we can't really predict. We have a 50% prediction model by the heliophysics community until this guy, Bruce Cragen, a semi-retired radio engineer from rural New Hampshire, was able to build a predictive model that predicts in 75%. The NASA folks tested it and saw it actually works 80%. So this was a big storm in the heliophysics community, understanding that this guy in less than 3 months solved a problem that was standing for a decade. The budget that was on this problem between NASA and other organizations stands between, I think, $600,000 million a year. So this is a huge problem. He got an award of $30,000. And as I can tell you, the head of radiation unit, when they saw that, they said, this is spun up so fast here and has caught everyone off guard. Turnaround time for a solution like this could take years. So now my question is, then what do the R&D professionals do once they see this solution? Okay, that's the first research question. How does it impact their work? So the day after, everyone is excited from the management and up, all the way to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. They get encouraged, they get compliments, but then they go back to the lab and things start exploding. People start arguing with each other. Should they use it? Should they not use it? Just to give you a taste of some of the cool qualitative data that I was able to gather, because there was so much tension on the table. So some people said, if I can't do it at NASA, what's keeping me from going somewhere else? Like, I'm here to be able to think and solve greater problems. Why would I do it? People talked about open innovation and incentive as a slap in the face, as insulting. Other people said that this is like cheating. Every time they have a problem, they're going to post it somewhere online. Like, what's the point? Why are they here? Why did they spend all these years coming to NASA? In the same time, their colleagues would respond to them and say, at the end of the day, it's about the big agenda. We want to get to Mars. This person helped us. Why do we care? So forget about the personal agenda. Science is about finding the truth. And this process was kind of ongoing for a year until a very pivotal moment took place when one highly esteemed scientist stood up and told her colleagues, enough. You shouldn't care. You shouldn't care. The solution may come from your lab, from your contractor, from collaborator, an open innovation platform. You shouldn't care. You are no longer the problem solver. You are the solution seeker. And from that moment and on, they started talking about who are they and what is their role and what does it mean to be a problem solver, and that's what they were used to, versus being this solution seeker. And I call this process an identity refocusing, because they kind of took a step back, stopped focusing on the how of their work, asked themselves, why are we doing this work? And can we, if we focus on that, how can we change the how? And that's a place that I think we need to think more about. What are those new capabilities that are required? Are we training engineers and scientists to be solution seekers, to work this way? And I can tell you that most of the organizations that I talk to, I see that the answer is no. And that's why it's very hard. To give you kind of the gist of the story, and is that those people that their professional identity went through this refocusing process, that they kind of changed the way they think about themselves, dismantled their knowledge boundaries, brought in, implemented the knowledge that was found through open innovation platforms, and also next year and the following years opened their new problems to open innovation and used these platforms more and more, and even went all the way to change their whole process. And those people that protected their identity and felt threatened by this obviously did not use it, and some of them, actually more than a half, used it but just left the knowledge outside. And that's what we see in many organizations, unfortunately. To be able to change and dismantle your knowledge boundaries really means to think differently about your daily work. One quote that captures it, I think, is the R&D lab manager that said, this is a shift from thinking the lab is my world when I come every day to my lab, to all of a sudden the whole world is my lab. How do I orchestrate R&D that is done throughout the world? What do I do? What is that role? On the extreme, the people that fully dismantled, indeed some of them even left their labs and started a whole R&D process that is different. And to give you a sense, the people that dismantled were 30% versus 30% that protected, so this was pretty impactful, and the kind of the theory message that I want to take home with, I hope you can take home with, is that it really matters what people think about their own role and how they're trained and about their own work, and that can matter all the way to where does innovation happen, where is the locus of innovation. So those people that were able to rethink their work and their role basically shifted the locus of innovation outside the traditional boundaries of NASA and what was the process before. And it led to new innovation in the following year. Significant innovation, much faster, much quicker, and much cheaper. The second research question, I don't have much time, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards more about it. That's about how is that process different? And I can just tell you that it's one thing to look at the R&D process in the traditional world. It's another thing to think what the solvers outside see. They just see this 2-page of a problem defined by NASA, right? And that makes a big difference. So their first lesson learned was it really is key how we articulate the problem, and we know that. Herbert Simon wrote about that. This is important. But we have here a research opportunity, because for the first time, I think, we have those people that define the problem completely separate from those that solve it. So usually in science, you know, you can't get to Einstein's head and see how does he think about the problem and then he thinks about the solution. It was very hard to separate. But here we have this clear separation. So what I did, I basically looked in those 14 problems and tried to understand how did they formulate it in a way that crossed these boundaries, that people outside of the discipline were able to solve. How come this Bruce Craigan was able to solve a problem that all the heliophysics experts are not? And I looked into this emergent problem formulation process that happened, and I realized some of these problems stayed the same, were just better organized, but some were completely reformulated. When they thought I'm going to take it outside, they really did a lot of thinking and really changed the way the problem was formulated. So to give you the end, I'll just share with you that that problem of the solar flare, when they posted it, was not a solar flare problem. They decontextualized it, and it looked like a data prediction problem. And that's it. So if you want more, I'm happy to talk later. Thank you.